A chart reached Bowdoin College more than a century after the Karluk sank. Its marks trace the drift. They trace the sinking. The museum identified it as Robert Bartlett's own working chart, the one he carried through the ice and brought home himself. Not a copy. The original. That chart is where this episode begins. Not with the expedition's promises, not with the man who left, with the object a captain made, kept, and carried out of the Arctic because he had walked far enough to make sure there was someone left to save. In September 1913, Vilhjalmur Stefansson stepped off the Karluk to hunt. The man he left aboard would cross ice in Siberia because the ship had already delivered its warning. This is the story of how that warning was given and why the men who received it still sailed north. Before the ship left port, the ice captain looked at his vessel and formed a judgment. Bartlett was a Newfoundlander, a man who had worked under Robert Peary and understood the difference between ships that came back and ships that did not. He had felt what sustained ice pressure does to a wooden hull, pack ice squeezing from the sides and below, slowly over days and weeks, until something in the structure gives. He knew what a purpose-built Arctic vessel felt like under his feet, and he knew that Karluk was not one. She had been reinforced for northern work. That reinforcement was real, but reinforcement is not the same as being built for the ice from the keel up. In Bartlett's 1916 account, he kept returning to the comparison with Roosevelt, the ship that had carried the Peary expedition. Roosevelt had been designed for broken ice in a way Karluk had not. Old, wooden, underpowered. Those were the words he used. The concern existed before departure. It was documented. The expedition proceeded anyway. Here is what matters about that sequence. The warning was not a stamped form or a protest filed in an office. It was an ice captain looking at an old wooden ship and understanding that the Arctic would test the difference between repaired and fit. He was right about the difference. He sailed anyway. And that is not a simple story about one man abandoning a ship. It is a harder story about two men who both accepted a risk they both understood. If Bartlett saw the danger, why did he sail? If Stefansson knew the ship's limitations, why did the plan continue as designed? And when 11 men died and a vessel was lost, why was there no public reckoning? Those are the three questions this episode follows. The Canadian Arctic expedition was not a private venture. It was organized under Canada's Department of Naval Service, government-backed and government-named, and it carried a mixed company north into a plan that was still being shaped as the ships moved. Scientists, sailors, Inuit hunters, among them an Alaskan man named Kataktovick, a seamstress, 2 children. That name, Kataktovick, will matter later. Vilhjalmur Stefansson led the Northern Division. He believed there might be undiscovered land north of the Beaufort Sea, a geographical theory not yet disproven, and the expedition gave him the means to test it. The Northern theory did not just tempt Stefansson. Later scholarship makes the point harsher. It helped tempt Bartlett too. The lure was the same for both men. Both chose to go. What they disagreed about, before the ice and after, was whether the ship they were sailing in could survive the expedition they had agreed to. Canada wanted a presence in the Arctic. Stefansson offered the method. The method required a ship. The ship available was Karluk. By August 1913, the ice had already settled the question of whether Karluk could handle what had been asked of her. She was caught, carried helplessly west, locked into drift, unable to steer toward open water, unable to break free. The ship had stopped being transport and had become a moving camp, pulled by ice that moved on its own schedule toward a destination no one aboard had chosen. Bartlett kept a journal. His entries through the drift are practical. Supplies, positions, conditions. The language of a captain still doing his job under circumstances that had already exceeded the job's original description. Then the expedition's leader stepped off the ship. On September 20th, Stefansson went ashore for hunting purposes. A gale drove Karluk away during his absence. Whether that departure was a hunting trip that weather made permanent, a misjudgment about risk, or something more deliberate, the sources do not resolve cleanly. What is confirmed is the fact. He left, the gale came, and the ship did not return to him. The people left aboard were not an abstract crew. They were the scientists, the sailors, the hunters, the seamstress, the 2 children. and a captain now responsible for every one of them inside a ship the ice was already studying for weakness. On the 10th of January 1914, the ice opened the Karluk's hull. Water entered the ship. On the 11th, Karluk disappeared. From the moment the hull was breached, the question was no longer how to save the ship. It was how much could be moved off before she went under. Bartlett had prepared, in the weeks before the end, anticipating what was coming. Supplies moved to the ice, shelters built, a camp established on a surface that was itself still drifting. Shipwreck Camp was not rescue. It was the beginning of a longer problem. Bartlett did not march everyone south immediately. The long Arctic night was not a metaphor. Moving inexperienced people over broken sea ice in near total darkness was a way to lose more people than the ship had already cost. Waiting meant rationing. Moving in darkness meant gambling with lives he could not afford to lose. He waited for usable light. 4 men did not wait. They chose to leave Shipwreck Camp on their own terms. Bartlett equipped them. They gave him a letter absolving him of responsibility for the decision. They were not seen again. Another party moved toward Wrangel Island, off the Siberian coast, which had been identified as the nearest solid land. They reached land, not Wrangel. They ended on Herald Island, east of the intended destination, and did not survive. The question of their exact fate traveled forward through the rescue story for years before remains provided part of an answer. 17 people reached Wrangel Island in March 1914. In a story about rescue, an arrival can sound like safety. It was not safety. It was solid ground to wait on. The waiting still had to be survived. 6 days after the survivors reached Wrangel, Bartlett left the island with Kataktovick, an Alaskan Inupiat hunter who had sailed with the expedition from the beginning. The two of them walked out across the ice to find help for the people they left behind. The distance covered is broadly remembered as 700 miles total. The contemporary government summary separately records more than 160 miles of Arctic ice crossed before Bartlett reached the Siberian coast. 2 men, 1 objective, no backup. Getting to land did not end the work. Bartlett still had to move down the Siberian coast, find passage, cross to Alaska, and get a message to Ottawa specific enough that a rescue vessel could be dispatched to an island most people in Ottawa had no particular reason to know. Kataktovick traveled with him through the Siberian portion of the journey. His knowledge of the terrain and conditions was not incidental to the crossing. It was part of what made the crossing possible. Bartlett eventually reached Alaska. He communicated the survivors' position to the Department of Naval Service. The vessel King and Wing reached Wrangel Island in September 1914, almost 8 months after the sinking. The survivors were taken off and transferred to the Bear. Bartlett was reunited with them after the rescue had already happened, meaning the people he had left behind had managed themselves, rationed what remained, and kept enough order to still be alive when the ship arrived. 11 men did not come home. Some disappeared in the independent marches from Shipwreck Camp. 3 died on Wrangel Island before the rescue vessel arrived. The expedition that had sailed from Victoria in June 1913 returned with 11 people gone and no grave that could be visited. There was also no inquest, no formal proceeding, no moment where the government that had organized and funded the expedition was required to answer in public for what the expedition had cost. 11 men were dead. The ship was gone. There was no public inquiry. Historian Janice Cavell found no record of a formal investigation into the Karluk disaster. No board of inquiry, no official determination of whether the vessel had been fit, whether the decision to sail had been sound, whether 11 deaths required a public answer. In the absence of that reckoning, reputations became the only record. The public version was clean. Bartlett had walked out of the Arctic and delivered his survivor's position. That story had a shape. 1 man, 1 journey, 1 act of responsibility. It was celebrated, and the celebration was not wrong about what he had done. What came after was less clean and less public. Stefansson made insinuations and private criticisms of Bartlett in the years that followed. Bartlett's 1916 memoir was its own argument in return. Each man's account was also a defense. Neither covered the whole picture. The Canadian Arctic Expedition produced its official scientific reports. The science continued. What the Karluk disaster did not produce was the kind of inquiry that puts responsibility into public language where it cannot be privately revised. There is no surviving document in which Bartlett, Stefansson, and the expedition's sponsors sat together, named the ship's weaknesses, and recorded what they decided. Maybe the warnings were sharper than the surviving record shows. Maybe the risk was more deliberate than anyone later admitted. We do not know. That missing document is part of the disaster. My cautious read is that the familiar version gives each man too simple a role. Stefansson as the man who left, Bartlett as the man who saved. The record is harsher because it suggests both men accepted the risk before the ice made the risk visible. Bartlett's concern about the ship was genuine and early. It did not prevent him from sailing. Stefansson's ambition defined what the expedition would attempt. His departure on September 20th turned a dangerous drift into a separation no one aboard could undo. But the expedition they had both agreed to was already depending on a vessel an experienced ice captain had already judged inadequate. So the three questions do not resolve cleanly. Bartlett sailed because the same ambition that endangered the ship also drew him north. Stefansson continued because the expedition's ambition only worked if someone was willing to gamble with the ship. And Canada never forced the disaster into a public accounting. That is why the story survived as reputation, not verdict. Among those who reached Wrangel Island and were taken off by King and Wing was the youngest person who had sailed aboard Karluk. She was 3 years old. The records give her name as Mugpie, also recorded as Mukpie. A Library and Archives Canada image places her among the survivors. She had been aboard since departure from Victoria. She had been aboard through the drift, through the sinking, through the march to Wrangel, through the months of waiting for a ship that took 8 months to come. She came home on the rescue vessel. At the end, the cleanest record is not a verdict. It is a small child on a rescue ship, alive because the captain who feared the Karluk still walked out to find help.